How you doing? We're gonna get started in just a minute. Are you able to share screen? Great.
Hello, good people. Enormously honored to be sharing real time and virtual space with you. My name is Garret Graddy-Lovelace. I am research and teach seed politics and agriculture at American University School of International Service. I'm a novice seed keeper myself. And extraordinarily honored to be among such activists and frankly living legends. I can't believe that Winona LaDuke, who's like a hero of mine, just preceded me. It's like beyond, I mean, Winona, you were the first person I ever voted for as a presidential, vice presidential candidate. And it was the best vote of my life. And it's been downhill ever since, everything before. So enormously honored. And of course, also we have Chief Vincent Mann, enormous effort. That was an exquisite invocation. Thank you so much for setting that sacred space for us this morning. Karen Washington, beloved mentor and legendary matriarch of urban ag. Raj Patel, such a brilliant analyst and gracious comrade. Senator Cory Booker, doing such beautiful and powerful work on voting rights and reparations, as well as labor, and now CAFO moratorium, such great work on the Hill. And Nate, such a fearless seed keeper, so many other people in this lineup. So a huge round of applause to Nagisa and to Tony and to Scott for this stellar lineup, and also to the entire New Jersey North American Farmers Alliance. What a powerful organization doing really extraordinary work. So I am currently in Kentucky, which is a land of extreme indigenous erasure and colonial genocide and enslavement, but also liberatory abolition work under the leadership of bell hooks, among others, rest in peace and power. But I work and am based in DC, Maryland, which is Piscataway and Anacostia Nacotchtank lands and waterways. And also DC is hopefully soon to be a state, Douglas Commonwealth, if things progress in the way they need to. So I'm here today to talk with you about a topic that I've been deeply engrossed in personally, spiritually, socially, academically, intellectually, and politically for a decade and a half or more: seeds and the power of seeds and agricultural biodiversity. And this is the lineup for the day. It's a whole journey. So I'm so honored to be on this journey with you. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat and we can kind of keep thinking this through together. So there's a dominant conception of seeds power, which is that the powerful seeds are the ones that have high inputs, mass irrigation, they're dependent on synthetic fertilizers, they're extraordinarily toxic, far-reaching in their expenses, their molecular alteration, genomic editing, very high-tech technologies in the molecular codes of the seeds. They're designed deliberately a single season, unable to be saved biologically if they're hybrid seeds, F1 inbred from the Green Revolution, or legally if they're genetically modified or genomically edited and are under copyright protection, patents, plant variety protections, utility patents, all the rest. So they're single season deliberately, either biologically or legally, and all are grown and bred and designed, hyper designer seeds for high yields of commodity flex crops. And so the philanthropic arm, the developmental industry, working in allegedly kind of developing the world's agriculture, policy worlds at the UN level, even in academic research, all of these sectors locate the power of seeds as this. This is the ultimate powerful aspect of seeds. But actually, this logic breaks down even on its own terms. Plants that live for one growing season remain genetically unconnected to all the prior and subsequent botanical generations. So their molecular makeup, so designer expresses itself just once in one growing season. So there's a temporal segregation that isolates these seeds from their antecedent and their descendant relatives. It also isolates them from any genetic memories, as well as genetic memory making. They are cut off from the process, the ancient agroecological process of learning from past biotic and abiotic stresses and carrying that resilience and genetic memory into the future. So there's a temporal segregation that's designed with kind of the dominant modern seed system, but there's also a spatial segregation, and you will already know this obviously as farmers and practitioner experts. It's worth kind of unpacking and thinking this through. High commodity crop yield, single season seeds grow in vast fields of genetic uniformity. This is counter to seeds, for instance, these are from the Amaru community in Andean Peru that I had the honor of working with for the past decade and a half as part of the potato part. So this spatial strategy of territorial dominance has actually become vast. Monocultures, as you all know, are ancient. There were the colonial arm. So colonialism was agricultural at heart, and agriculture has a colonial essence to it within the Americas. So the whole premise of colonial genocide, of expansion, of enslavement, and all of the kind of racial capitalism that entailed had agriculture as its mechanism, as its process, and as its product for profit and ongoing expansions. So cotton, obviously sugar, these large scale, and then it became wheat in the Green Revolution. So this is not a new phenomenon, but the spatial extent of it is really breathtaking. There's really something stunning once you kind of realize the extent of acreage in North America, in the US and in Canada, that has become kind of a reign of high input, genetically monocultural crop production. And obviously this is, you know, what you all have devoted your life to countering. But even just thinking geopolitically about the expanse all throughout the Amazon, this is literally burning. The largest forest in the world is soybean production and broader livestock flex commodity systems and complexes on through Paraguay, Uruguay, on through into Argentina, obviously, as well. So we've got this spatial strategy of dominance, this temporal strategy of dominance, and they're very isolated. But what this misconception of seeds' power, that the most powerful seeds are the ones that dominate, that are genetically uniform and spatially and temporally segregated, and nothing else is allowed to grow in their mix. Any weed is rounded up, you know, with glyphosate and herbicide. Any insect is kind of killed with the life cycle of Bacillus thuringiensis, which are Bt seeds, which express that insecticidal property throughout their entire life cycle. So there's just kind of indiscriminate killing of insects. So this kind of territorial, mutually exclusive, it is just these crops and nothing else. That idea that that's power, that's the power of seeds, has enabled a systemic capture of seeds' actual value and a subsequent political economic consolidation and empire. And this would be new to you, but it's worth just reiterating why this has not garnered more political resistance. There were long histories of antitrust, long histories of populist resistance to big banks, big industries. Even within agricultural context, there's long histories of farmers having coalitions to fight the kind of broader monopolies of agricultural sector. And yet, where is the resistance now? It's in the fringes, it's there, but in terms of the main agricultural sectors of farmers, the commodity groups within, even on the Hill, in the Senate and the House and Senate Ag Committee, there is such a failure to keep in check the extraordinary mergers and the acquisitions that have happened quite recently, and the corresponding spike in seed costs that farmers have had to bear the brunt of. So these companies are frankly larger than the British Empire and the kind of empires of old in terms of market, global market dominance, in terms of power and biopolitical control of the food system. And yet the kind of lack of, even I teach at the School of International Service, the lack of classes that even talk about this. There's 130 faculty. I'm the only one doing ag policy in a school that's allegedly analyzing the world. And so this kind of the kind of tragedy that what's happening in agriculture is so misunderstood and also so dismissed and disregarded as something peripheral, so crux. So the power of seeds, the actual power of seeds, vastly surpasses and upends the dominant misconceptions of power itself. And this is kind of the theme of my work and the book itself. So seeds' actual power, which I'll get to over the course of the next few slides, is in their connection to their temporal antecedent, into the spatial surroundings of where they are, into the agroecological matrix of agricultural biodiversity. Agricultural biodiversity is the variety and the variability of crops, crop relatives, livestock, of biota in the soil, of pollinators, obviously also of, even like our, gut bacteria, like all of these kind of myriad ecological cycles that comprise agroecology and agrobiodiversity in action. If a seed is connected to that, if it's proximate to that, if it emerges from that, then that's actually the power of ecological resilience and of genetic value. So seeds' actual power as vitality, as variability, as potentiality, as resourcefulness, as genetic memory correlates to their proximity to, not distance from, agricultural biodiversity. And yet that's completely, kind of lacking in the broader policy world. Agricultural policy began, frankly, in terms of thinking about the governance of agrobiodiversity and plant genetic resources, food and agriculture in the mid-20th century as a response to the decline of agrobiodiversity with the Green Revolution. Now, there's always been seed collections going on. It's actually an ancient phenomenon to collect seeds, obviously, but the kind of imperial collection of seeds began with colonialism. And so you'd have these plant explorers go out into the world and into the periphery and then pull the seeds back and collect them at the core and then analyze them, render them legible, render them, profitable, and build commercialized varieties from them. And so there's actually a very interesting article here about Vavilov. Winona gave a shout out to Vavilov. It was a very compelling character. But there's, on one hand, just seed collection is so powerful and interesting in terms of the value of genetic diversity being circulated, but there's oftentimes an imperial dimension to it. And so this was a pretty interesting article that came out about how Germany and the US and the Soviet Union would gather varieties, but from kind of a eugenic standpoint of saving it from the masses, very racialized understanding of masses, and bringing them back to cultivate for a racial hierarchy of white supremacism. So there's an insidious nature of biodiversity collection, and yet, it is the history. So kind of thinking it through, Vavilov was key in his team. Actually, I was also female plant collectors who he worked with. There was a very diverse team within the Russian context. Were the first to kind of map out these mega centers of crop origin and diversity. There was Eurocentric aspects to this, a lot of ignorance about African content, and a lot of indigenous erasure, but nevertheless, it was kind of a template to what became the foundation for the research centers of the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, which are the major gene banks of the world. So this is CIMMYT, which is in Mexico, which is kind of, it tries to collect all of the germplasm of corn and maize. The CIP, which is the Center for International Potato in Lima. IFPRI is the kind of policy angle one. That's not a seed bank, but it's kind of the policy arm of this operation in DC. But they're all over the world, and I'm sure you all have worked with them or know of them. But this is kind of where Exit 2, which is offsite preservation of germplasm, is anchored in these kind of CGIAR centers around the world. So what about that? Saving the seeds by taking it from the fields, which is the common heritage of humankind, bringing them back into these centers, and then allowing plant breeders to work with them and develop commercialized varieties that are then subject to plant variety protection and then kind of territorially divorced or decontextualized from their agricultural origins. Obviously, this was problematic and controversial. So this question of access to genetic material in these gene banks and who's getting the benefit from them were the ABS wars of the 80s and the 90s. In the global South, communities were saying, we're the gene-rich places of the world. The global North is actually gene poor, and yet they're the ones who benefited financially, agriculturally, epistemically. They're the alleged experts on agrobiodiversity. So there's a massive asymmetry and a global scale appropriation happening. And so they got so bad, these seed wars, that a treaty happened, the International Treaty of Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, which 2001, the ink was dry, and then it came into force in 2004. And so on paper, it looks like it was a victory. So there was a recognition of the enormous contribution of farmers. It's not just in genetic resources. There were actually people involved in it, and that there's a lot of diversity that's important. There needs to be a global system for farmers to benefit, as well as plant breeders and scientists. You can see that this treaty was definitely a negotiation. There was a feeling of it being many divergent viewpoints kind of coming together in a forced consensus, but one that at the time seemed very generative. And so this question of benefit sharing needs to be there. Now, what's happened 2 decades later? Not much on the farmers' rights front. When you go to the website, things look beautiful. There's always great pictures, oftentimes of women. It's kind of a little bit problematic. There's a lot of racialized images of great people in the fields farming, but who's actually the one who are running the gene banks? Who are the people who are actually making the decisions? And are any of the people in the photos involved in the decision making? Are they even named, frankly? These experts in the field that get kind of glossy pictures in terms of thinking through who the actual expertise is of agrobiodiversity conservation and who should be making the decisions on how farmers' rights get actually integrated into policy at the federal or international level. So farmers' rights look great on paper. Very few countries have actually implemented them. Peru, because of some mobilization, has. India has some degree of this, and there's a few other countries in the world that have made kind of attempted inroads, but in the aggregate, it has been in paper only, because the dominant intellectual property right regimes have grown even more proprietary in the 2 decades since. So now there's been this whole kind of array of policies. You've got the Nagoya Protocol, which is saying, okay, access and benefit sharing. You cannot just take all of the germplasm and commercialize it without having prior informed consent with the communities that develop that material, without having material transfer agreements, without having benefit sharing kick back to those communities. And then the global crop diversity, which is supposed to be where all the funding of the treaty goes, also looks great on paper, but in fact is explicitly only about ex situ. So then the state of the world's planetary resources, I've poured through all of them. There's a lot of convoluted language, a lot of vague language. Every once in a while, there's a sentence that was worth underlining and using as a leverage point in political organizing. This one on page 4 was there's justifying the need for greater attention to be paid to on-farm management. We actually do need to pay attention to how the seeds actually happen and not just treat them like resources for the taking, but coordinate support for the conditions of their ongoing regeneration. But when it actually comes to thinking through what that would look like, no resources, no funding, and not much attention. In fact, the money flows and it's flowing, there is money, and it's flowing to ex situ or hyper conservation. The Global Crop Diversity Trust is the major foundation that takes the money from the treaty and all the donors and turns it into gene bank support. Now, ex situ or gene banks are very important, particularly as overall numbers of agrobiodiversity decline. These gene banks are actually quite precious. There are treasuries of germplasm in there. So it's not a matter of ex situ should be deleted or ex situ, en situ kind of should presuppose ex situ. The question is the ex situ gets all the resources and who has access, and again, is the benefit being shared. And then you've also got these discourses that, this is from all the funding material, there's very fancy fundraisers that say, you rich person, rich country, rich philanthropist, i.e. the Gates Foundation, if you give your millions here, don't even worry about it. Conservation done, check, over. But, well, we've got it forever. So this presumption that if it's kept in a gene bank, the problem is solved is such a dangerous presumption, not just from a research standpoint, from a policy perspective, and just from an economic perspective of where the funding is going. One of the most famous ex situ is super ex situ, super off-site. It's in a place where there's no soil, is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. And this Global Seed Vault, again, is very compelling and actually quite beautiful as a global project of collaboration. The premise here is that every seed in the whole world, they're going to try to have a backup copy of. Okay, that's admirable, I guess, if the entire world, I mean, God forbid, something even more horrible things happen. But again, this question of as if that's going to solve it. How are the farmers actually going to get to the North Pole to get those seeds if some kind of major economic or ecological or military catastrophe happens? And also there's a geopolitical assumption that somehow northern Norway is safe from the geopolitical strife that the tropics have or that the Middle East has. There's a huge seed bank in Syria that was destroyed in Aleppo recently. There was one in Iraq, Abu Ghraib, that was bombed in the US invasion of Iraq. So this kind of idea that some places in the world are immune or innocent from geopolitical strife that could jeopardize seed collections already has a racialized geopolitical imaginary. In fact, Putin is building missile strikes, right near in war testing right outside of Svalbard. So this kind of northern part of the globe is certainly not immune to authoritarianism and to very dangerous political strife that could jeopardize this very valuable germplasm. I had the honor of going to Svalbard. It's so cold and so exquisite. There I walked this bunker. There's a concave entrance to deflect any missile that would happen to be in there or be attacked there. I get to the central room that's supposed to have a backup copy of all of the world seeds, and it's so low tech. It's like a lot of boxes of Tupperware. It's this the most agribiodiverse room in the world. It's very kind of surreal and interesting. But meanwhile, the big move by the Crop Trust is crop wild relative projects. So there's been enormous money, more tens of millions of dollars, not going to farmers, not going to indigenous and African diaspora seed keepers, but going to this crop wild relative project. And so this is very interesting for us to think about, because this is actually a recognition of the real power of seeds as being proximity to agrobiodiversity. Do you see? Because actually those modern varieties of seeds need genetic infusions. So the seed breeders, they might produce a seed that is just a single season seed, but over time, obviously the insects will become stronger than the insecticide, the weeds will become stronger than the herbicides. And so there will need to be new varieties, new ways for a drought resistant aspect or a trait or a certain kind of herbicide, resistant trait to be kind of formulated through these various, plant breeding mechanisms. And so the constant search for more and more genetic material that is resistant ecologically and has the genetic memory of resilience, the real power of seeds, is being sought after. So you've got all of these plant breeders very, very conscious of the real power of seeds. Let's be honest about it now, and be thinking through how to access it. But even the way it's accessed kind of carries on this problematic imaginary. So climate crises abound, and here we have the weakness, the real weakness of modern varieties laid bare, their intrinsic vulnerabilities, their hyper-dependence upon so much water, upon so much fossil fuels, upon so many toxins, and on their fresh genetic infusions. This is laid bare for us with climate crises. Meanwhile, the genetic responsiveness of open pollinated varieties, of land races, of all that they bring, the heterogeneity, the adaptability, the ancestral answers to abiotic and biotic stresses, the way they work with the surrounding agroecologies. Crop wild relatives are molecular treasuries of options. They are the veritable elders of agroecological survival. But now, wouldn't this overdue realization of how powerful they are, so, as weeds, they've been so long vilified, wouldn't this bring a reckoning? Because after all, who's known this all along? The indigenous and the African diaspora farmers around the world who have valued and protected agrobiodiversity, land races, and crop wild relatives for millennia. Where's the recognition to them? Shouldn't there be a sector-wide apology and reparations for aggressively undermining their efforts all these years, but now recognizing that actually it was crux for all of our survival? That hasn't happened yet. Meanwhile, what's happening in the other gene banks? This is the biggest gene bank in the US, the National Gene Bank, where our taxpayer money dollars are going. And I went and visited them. And they had this map here of how proud they were of how many, they've got enormous germplasm samples and how they're distributing it all over the world. These are the kind of lines of distribution. It's not going to farmers, it's not going to indigenous, self-identified groups, it's going to laboratories and researchers. And the question of why, their response is we don't have the bandwidth. And that is true. That's very interesting to think about from a governance perspective. They are funded to hold on to those seeds it actually takes a lot of technological expertise to make sure that the seeds themselves are kept alive in dormancy in these gene bank scenarios. And cryopreservation, there's all kinds of important technologies for doing this. But the question that there's no governance support for actually distributing it to farmers is such a governance fail. Nate, by the way, is like single-handedly with his crew of Experimental Farm Network countering that. But things get even more dicey, people, you all know this, but dematerialization is the new word in agricultural policy. And so this means that it's not just the germplasm with advanced genomic sequencing, it becomes data, becomes big data. And where does the big data live? It's in these big repositories and gene banks, and various breeders can just access it through these kind of online portals. And through this new project DivSeq, they can kind of rework their own breeding through genomic editing and other genomic practices to use the data from these other germplasms to furnish all the kind of agricultural products that are needed for the commercialized food economy. Now, the Via Campesina has called this out though, and they said, We inherited our seeds from our parents. We've looked after them carefully, selected and conserved them for future generations. We have given them to you, the treaty, in trust to protect them and our knowledge, and have always been proud to share our work. We're not selfish with these seeds. We're giving them for research, for circulation. We thought that we would have them protected by being appropriated through the farmers' rights. You talked about that in the treaty, farmers' rights. But instead, you're launching the DivSeq program, which will scan them all to publish them in electronic databases, which then have no protections or farmers' rights aspects to them. And so they say, as long as the treaty does not prohibit those who have access to the seeds from claiming patents, which they don't right now, you can have derivatives from what you take from the multilateral system, which is part of the treaty, and certainly commercialize that or put that under plant variety protection. We, the farmers who continue to use, exchange, and sell them via Campesina, will recommend that we no longer give these seeds and this material to the multilateral treaty system. The Via Campesina encourages developing country governments to require the same commissions, so they're going to pressure their own governments to stop giving those seeds to the treaty and the multilateral system unless there's more protections and prevention of bioprospecting and biopiracy. So that actually worked. For a moment there, the treaty actually deleted their account and their negotiations and deal with DivSeq. There's actually a little bit of a victory there on the part of the seed movements of the world. But when you look at the broader agrobiodiversity mainstreaming agrobiodiversity products, you see that still you've got this idea of germplasm as resources and genes in the field for the taking. And the cultural context of where those seeds come from, the gendered, it's often women, it's largely indigenous, African diaspora, land-based people who are doing the work of upkeeping those foodways, those agricultural skills, is not there. Colonialism, not there. The agrarian crisis, not there. Ag policy, not there. And so the kind of omissions of this, I think, are so fascinating. And there's a few sentences here and there that talk about the need for agrarian viability, but they're so minor. Meanwhile, the entire CG system has just gone to one CJR, which is a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation corporate essentially to minimize participatory plant breeding projects and have there be kind of a major flow of research on genomic editing and digital sequence information straight as a pipeline to breeders. So kind of very troubling things happening there. So that's all that's happening in ag policy. You can see the problematic aspects. But meanwhile, agricultural policy, farm policy itself, is ignoring agricultural biodiversity. So there's a mutual avoidance between these two elements. So agricultural policy, you think it's about scarcity and about the need to feed the world because there's a scarcity of food. It's not that, you all know this, but it's actually never been about scarcity from an ag policy perspective in the US. In fact, there's always been the crisis of surplus. So I've been doing research in the agricultural library in the USDA in Beltsville, and commodity crop surplus has long been seen as a burden and plumage of empire. World War I, this changed, and there was a specific government intervention to ramp up production. So Europeans were in the trenches, and the government said, everybody, and if you have a tractor, if you have a farm, go out there and plant enormous quantities of wheat. So the prairie was dug up, those deep-rooted prairie grasses were dug up, and enormous quantities of wheat were grown. Prices were good. And when prices are good, farmers grow more. So prices were very good in the 1914, 1915, 1916. And then World War II, World War I, the end, people got out of the trenches, the survivors went back to their fields, grew their own wheat. There was way too much wheat on the global market. Prices went down. In the US, the response of the farmers when prices were down was to grow more, because they had loans and they had to pay them. So there was this kind of desperation. So more and more production happened, and then there was way too much wheat on the global market and prices outright collapsed. This was devastating, and you had tons of farmers converge in DC to demand some kind of assistance. They were largely white and male, but there was class diversity and political diversity. Many were communist, many were capitalist, and so there was a whole idea of a strike, a farmers' general strike that was important. The crisis of prices lent itself to an entire rural economy collapse, which lent itself to an entire economic collapse and was the Great Depression. So it catalyzed the broader Great Depression in the US and elsewhere, as well as, of course, the ecological disaster of the Dust Bowl, because all of those deep-rooted prairie grasses were gone. There was nothing to hold on to the moisture. And when a dry season came, it all went into the air. And the USDA, when you ask about the origin of the Farm Bill now, they say when dust hit FDR's desk is the origin of the entire Farm Bill, crises of overproduction. So by the 1930s, you've had agricultural policy actually saying, okay, we have to stop overproduction. How do we do it? There was all of these reports talking about the need to decrease, this kind of riot of free competition. Did it help the farmer? No. Production ran wild. Surpluses piled higher and higher, but the farmer got no pay producing these excesses, and income fell lower and lower. So Wallace and FDR got together. In the 30s, you've had the first Farm Bill. Meanwhile, what surpluses were there, the US was already deploying to places like neo-colonies like Puerto Rico to inculcate dependence. So this kind of preliminary understanding of the geopolitical power of surplus was brewing in the 30s. But the broader goal was to decrease surpluses. So the first Farm Bill is an honest recognition of the economic and ecological ravages of unfettered agrocapitalism. But it was also mired in settler colonialism and racism. Black farmers as tenant farmers were systematically excluded from this government support. Meanwhile, the surplus was also being circulated to the farm food stamps. So there was already this idea of to move the surpluses. World War II happened, that kind of ended, and there was again this ramping up. Food will win the war, a very militaristic, imperial understanding of commodity crop production. After World War II, the quote unquote farm problem, which is how the USDA archives talked about it. It's just called the farm problem, and everyone knows what it is. This overproduction cycle returns. And then there was a more systematic imperial international food aid system and complex that was produced. PL 480, the Agricultural Act of the 50s, was about circulating this wheat surplus to Iran, Pakistan, India, Egypt, all of the post-colonial African countries to win the Cold War, and the US rose to geopolitical power off of deploying surplus wheat. And so the rest of the world got a little bit sketched out about this, the other countries in Europe, and tried to have this disposal of commodity surpluses governed so it wouldn't just destroy everyone's agriculture around the world. So the FAO actually had at its origin principles of surplus disposal. It was just so obvious to everybody that this problem was so systemic. The 1970s grain deal, all of a sudden, enormous quantities of wheat were sold, midnight telephone calls by Cargill, Archer-Daniels to Soviet Union. And what happened was the stores of wheat in the supply management system ended, and prices went through the roof for a second in the early 1970s. It led to the food price crisis in the 1970s. But on a domestic level in the US, the agricultural policy product was, hey, supply management, it's over. We're going to feed the world and win the war. Just keep growing. Just feed the world. Get big. Get out, or all buts. And again, the prices started to collapse because of this overproduction. This led to the 1980s farm crisis, which you all know. It's very close to home. My grandfather died of a massive heart attack after the bank called in his loans one Friday night back in 1984. But there was this mobilization in United Farmer Rancher Congress, and George Naylor were thinking about this ag crisis from the perspective of anti-corporate, the need for antitrust, and also Black land loss and solidarity with farmers and labor and farm workers, and international solidarity. So a very comprehensive 1980s farm justice movement. And so this just gets back to the Henry Wallace quotes. The crushing effects of surpluses will happen if there's no mutual support. Farmers and non-farmers have a responsibility to each other, and any dodging of this is going to end in ecological or economic disaster. So this kind of amnesia about this government commitment is so important. As it got eroded, number of farms goes down, size of farms go up, rural share population goes down. For Black farmers, this is way, way worse. 1996 Farm Bill ends all parity, all supply management. It's a total, amnesia. And then we get to this question of who benefited. Not many people benefited. In fact, a deeper analysis of the root cause of this mutual avoidance of farm policy, agrobiodiversity, and agrobiodiversity really just a corporate front on so many levels, gets back to coloniality. So agrobiodiversity omits agricultural context and thus avoids ag policy, as if agrobiodiversity were just objects and data to be taken. Meanwhile, ag policy values genetic resources as objects and data to be taken, and denigrates and destroys the people in the communities who are working on cultivating that. So who feeds whom in this feeding the world mythos? It's a very imperial one. It's colonial. It's built on a farce because everyone in the world doesn't want the dumping of US surplus. So coloniality, with its racialized, gendered, and class appropriations of social production, is at the heart of this. There's a consumptive bias, epistemological hierarchies of who's the expert and who's not. And so agricultural coloniality keeps persisting in these productivity fixations, IPR regimes, racial agrocapitalism, and even this kind of ramping up production. Even now, it's just going to be exported away, and all these other countries around the world will have to suffer it. Look at all of these disputes happening where all over the world people have said the hypocrisy of the US preventing any protection of local domestic products. So the true cost of dumping is devastating internationally. And so there's been resistance. The WTO out of agriculture is the rallying cry of the Via Campesina. And the Via Campesina is this massive organization around the world. They're at the FAO trying to get corporate agriculture, kept in check. And they adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, which is a huge victory on the UN level and really a result of all of this organizing by largely farmers who have been subjected to racial capitalism in agriculture. Who voted against it? Just the US. And Israel and the United Kingdom and Hungary, which is an authoritarian fascist leader right now, and Australia. So the fact that we in the US don't even know about this, I think it's because the word peasant is really blocking us. There's a concurrent understanding of the coloniality of agriculture in the US and elsewhere, but people around the world use the word campesino. In the US, peasant is just holding back the kind of international solidarity. Meanwhile, however, there's big calls to actually end the WTO. This is Michael Fakhri, who is the new special rapporteur on the human right of food. So there's mobilization happening. And so thinking through how to overcome the coloniality of agriculture with its focus on whiteness and white supremacism within agriculture and conservationism gets to a racialized understanding of how this feed the world paradigm takes root in terms of who gets to feed the world, and the reality of actually that's not even the case. So decolonized agriculture requires going back to Black agrarian justice movements, which are resurging right now. Everyone from Fannie Lou Hamer, an origin story of Black agrarian food sovereignty movements in the US, Monica White, who's written really beautifully about her, and we've had the honor of working with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives about thinking through the Black leadership in the 1980s food justice movement and farm justice movement. So the Federation obviously was key in Pigford, which you all know about, the class action lawsuit, which was the precedent for Keep Siegel, which was the indigenous growers class action lawsuit. The women farmers and Hispanic, total lack of intersectionality here, were denied class action status. So there's ongoing problems in having the coloniality and racism of the agricultural institutions in the USDA be called out. Fortunately, there's been some really good coverage of the racism and coloniality of agriculture. There's been important Senator Booker was one of the key for the Emergency Relief for Farmers of Color Act and Justice for Black Farmers. There was a wonderful farmers appeal for cancellation of Pigford debt. But that got blocked by racist injunction just last year. And thinking through how that could be blocked when there's so much obvious data on how racist the USDA and the broader agricultural system has led me, I've been working with Heather McGee, this was from yesterday, on thinking through her analysis and her great book, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, on applying that to agriculture and how there are these public goods like parity and supply management that the US has gone without because there was this fear that others around the world or Black farmers and farmers of color in the US would benefit from them, that led to their demise and their amnesia. But who has benefited? Not many people. Even the white farmers who still farm get their money off farm. The average income from farming that you get from farming has been below zero since that 1996 Farm Bill. So I think there's such a powerful story here about who's winning. It's the corporate elite, in this kind of broader concentration as farm debt rises. And obviously CAFOs are winning because of this surplus mountainous cheap grain sold below the cost of production. So I'll end on positive things. We've been doing community partnered research on these agrarian crisis issues and decolonizing agriculture for years. We've worked with the USDA, Rural Coalition, National Family Farm Coalition, Hopi farmer Michael Kotitwa Johnson. We've had the honor of visiting him and learning about indigenous and Hopi seed saving and how the USDA could actually support that rather than thwart that. And think of the Farm Bill itself. This is a special issue, and how this entire Farm Bill history is actually surplus, the prices of surplus hidden. So the commodities and conservation title, that's the crisis of surplus. That's the economic fallout and the ecological fallout. That's the origin of the Farm Bill way back in the 30s. Trade, surplus disposal. Nutrition, surplus disposal. Credit and rural development, agrarian crisis. And then research and extension has been kind of a biotech takeover. Forestry and energy, frankly, that's also just energy is corn surplus rerouted as energy. It's just a surplus disposal mechanism. And all the good stuff that you all are doing, the organics, the racial justice is tucked into the tiny little titles at the bottom, which don't get nearly enough funding. So kind of the re-understanding of the crisis of surplus and the coloniality of that as at the heart of ag policy transformation is very key. Wendell Berry, a mentor of mine, begins his recent book by saying, I want to say something about the decline, the virtual ruin of rural life here in Kentucky, and about the influence and effect of agricultural surpluses, which I believe are accountable for more destruction of land and water and people than any other economic factor, he says. So, kind of thinking the rural impacts of this kind of crisis of overproduction and the racialized implications of that as well. So this project, I see Liz is also in the audience, and she's been one of the co-leads on this with me for a few years. We're working with National Family Farm Coalition, Federation, Farm Aid, Food and Water Watch on updating supply management for racial and gender justice and for agroecology, to think through how it's not just commodity crop production, but it's actually surplus prevention, supply coordination, market management, and minimum support prices for diverse crops and mixed farming system. What could that look like? And that focuses and foregrounds BIPOC growers. So we've had Cornelius Blanding write about the role of land tenure. Obviously, Jim Goodman and George Naylor are mentors and heroes. We've had a lot of great speakers, and we've had a lot of, everyone from Dolores Huerta talk about how farm workers are just farmers without land, and how many of the farm workers in the US themselves are here because they couldn't make a living farming in their own places and homes, ancestral homes, because of the dumping of NAFTA corn, surplus corn. And Raj Patel, amazing Raj, who's speaking later today, Cornelius Blanding. We've also been thinking through connections with Enbridge, so Winona's important leadership and that amazing mobilization, stopping water poisoning is so connected to the broader ecocidal aspect of agrocapitalism unfettered. So our major thesis with this project is that updating parity could be a way for a whole new generation of BIPOC farmers in particular to make a living on the land. And so, it'll need updating. What happened in the 20th century wasn't perfect, but to forget it as a precedent is crazy. It was very powerful as a precedent. And if you knew a farmer, it was because they were making a living from the commodity title. So how can we update that agrarian viability and government commitment to agrarian viability for a much more diverse and decolonized food system? As we were working on this, the largest protest in recorded human history was going on about minimum support prices. So we've been in huge solidarity with the tens of millions of Indian farmers who are right. So very much depends upon a fair farm gate price and a secure market for agrarian viability to stave off agro-corporate capture. It all depends on that. And so we're working with Indra on connecting what Indian farmers are fighting against with what has happened to the US agriculture and the amnesia about it. And Raj Patel has been key in some of these collaborations, as well as Devinder Sharma. And think through the Indian farmer revolution as a potential tipping point for all international agricultural policy. Let's move beyond neoliberalism and racial capitalism. So the final thing we'll talk about here is in-situ-centered seed sovereignty movements. So when I began this work back in 2005, seed saving was so off the radar publicly. There was beautiful events and initiatives happening. Obviously, Winona LaDuke's work and her team at White Earth Reservation have been heroically working on this so bravely for millennia, but also, even more kind of for the public, engagement in terms of white rice protection in the last few decades. The Sin Maíz No Hay Maíz movement in Mexico, Nate's work, Experimental Farm Network, the Tetkoleti Paisan ICCN movement in Haiti, Dama, which is African Diaspora Seed Keeping Cooperative Farming Alliance. So much is happening right now. There's this boom of seed sovereignty movements, which are getting no policy support, no philanthropic support, very little research support. So just the extraordinary grassroots aspect of them is so powerful to behold, but also demands more kind of support from it. So my own work was with Appalachian seed communities. Part of my family is Appalachian. There's exquisite microdiversity of garlics and beans. And so this is a Kentucky pole bean. In the corner, I worked with Bill Best of Sustainable Mountain Ag Center, and had the honor of working in Peru with the potato park as they repatriated hundreds of native potato varieties from that big gene bank in situ centered. So the gene bank becomes not just ex situ centric, but centered and oriented toward returning and supporting the growers who originally were the stewards and cultivators of these precious crops. So learning about the selection of seed potatoes, how sacred that is, and the extraordinary agrobiodiversity of that region. So this led to a project on thinking through how research could benefit the people who are working on these initiatives. And so we're thinking through in-situ-centered policy, and we organized Encuentro meetings in Appalachia and Yucatan, and the Cusco one went online because of COVID. The one in Appalachia, Veronica is here, so she can on video and kind of talk a little about this as well in the question and answer, was thinking through data, who owns the data of the seeds, but also how do you support the agrarian viability so seeders make a living doing the exquisite and powerful work of upkeeping these immigrant African diaspora indigenous seed varieties. We had the honor of working with a mentor, Ira Wallace, who is the lead seed keeper at Southern Exposure Seed Exchange, of Karen Washington here. It was such an honor to be working with her on the urban understanding of how to connect with rural seed keeping movements and other really brilliant people. We were doing questions and pathway maps on under what conditions does agrobiodiversity nourish communities? How can we support it? Is it through price floors? What's the context? And we had Aaliyah Fraser and other brilliant seed keepers who were in this book, Land Justice, come and work with us as well. We crafted a document to the people who are leading the US, representing the US at the international treaty, saying that they need to take seriously the agricultural context of seeds and not just treat them as resources, as data. So we tried to get involved on that. Then we moved to Mexico and took all the findings from the Appalachian and translated them into Spanish and Mayan for our comrades in Mexico, and thinking through how can policy and research support agrobiodiversity and agrarian viability. We were connecting, Veronica and others were connecting cosmologies in Abya Yala and Turtle Island in North America and South America, particularly the Salagi Cherokee with Mayan cosmovisions, all rooted and grounded in agricultural biodiversity. And the importance of thinking through that is the power of seeds. These were beautiful encuentros, and they had a lot of deliverables in Mayan and in Spanish about this. And then the Peruvian one is also beautiful. So I'm going to end here. We have organized a special issue at the Open Access Journal. It's a bilingual multimedia open access about agrobiodiversity nourishment and the real power of seeds, which is their proximity to agrobiodiversity, and as cosmological and as sacred and as liberatory. And so come and submit papers, videos, interventions, policy interventions, practice interventions, and we'll publish them in this open access, all bilingual way to connect the beautiful seed sovereignty movements happening around the world together. Thank you.
Amazing, amazing stuff. It's such powerful information that you're laying on us right now. The overabundance of food that is created is just swamping economic opportunities for people all over the world. It's astonishing that we continue to produce this much, and we do it in such a dirty and nasty way. Oh, you're muted. Come back to us.
Garrett, we can't hear you right now. There you go.
Yeah, I was just saying amen. I was just saying amen, totally, exactly. Yeah. It's such a conundrum.
Yeah, and I love the concept of, I mean, rather than simply saving seeds in a vault under a glacier, let's just keep growing them and harvesting them and using them and breeding with them and stop locking them away in this disaster mindset.
Yeah, I had actually, this is a wonderful segue. I had just saw on a social media post, it was, most people in preparing for the apocalypse or preparing for the collapse, or, you know, maybe hopefully nothing collapses and we just continue to succeed. Maybe I want to reword that anyway, but some people are focusing on, oh, we need to keep guns and like, but no, we need to keep seeds. We need to keep food, because more importantly, if we don't have a way to make our hemp fiber or grow our food, we're out of luck. So this is wonderful. So we do have a couple questions came in. Let me scroll back up a little bit. The one I'm going to ask is, somebody had actually asked, does anybody know like what really occurs to educate the Gates Foundation? Or
I know Veronica and I are working on a paper, frankly, about white feminism and how the set of presumptions about saving the world and feeding the world are allegedly feminist, and yet have this racial hierarchy and this kind of ignorant. There's such an ignorance to what's actually happening in the world, such a lack of receptivity of even the critique. I'll drop the link here if I can find it, but billions, millions and millions have been spent in this new green revolution for Africa. And it hasn't even succeeded on its own terms. So not even equity, even on its own terms, it's been a failure. And so all of these leaders, these faith leaders, indigenous faith, interfaith leaders across the African continent wrote a letter to the Gates Foundation saying, please listen to us. Thank you for your good intentions and for circulating resources to us. It's been a fail. Let's talk. Just listen to us. Like let's think through the fail and the subjugation of how this money is being spent with your good intentions. And the Gates Foundation hasn't even responded.
We need a lot more with and a lot less to.
Yeah.
Like we need to do things with each other. Yeah.
I think academia is so implicated in this, which is why I think community partnered, community-led research is so powerful, because the real experts obviously are the practitioners and the ancient practitioners of communities like the Anishinaabe and the Ojibwe. I mean, obviously we need to just be sitting at the feet of the elders and the real seed keepers and orient academia for that and circulate the resources for supporting the amazing seed keeping that's been happening in the margins and center it.
Yeah, we've turned seed keeping into just another reductionist scientific process rather than trusting in 10,000 years of anecdotal cultural validity and information. I mean, it's what got us here, not 300 years of scientific method.
Last year, one of my favorite takeaways from Rowan White was she had talked about how everyone gets, in your generational hand-me-down, you get a little bag filled with the seeds of your ancestors before you, which in one light is great because they've been proven to work where you're from, assuming you stay local to where you're from. But that also obviously teaches that lesson. It reiterates the lesson of keep those seeds alive, not just us, but they're the seed genetics. So we are very closely approaching our end. You want to take this one last question? And then...
Sure. So we do have a very straightforward question of what would a non-racist, non-colonialist parity system look like?
That's beautiful. I, as a white Anglo person, obviously can't even presume to answer that. I will say it's been the honor of working with people from Leah Penniman to Rowan White, to even the people on the Disparity to Parity team, even people on the Agrobiodiversity, Nourishes Us team who are doing that work. So Ira Wallace, obviously Winona Duke, Karen Washington are the people to ask that question. But I think opening up space to listen. And even I'll just kind of quickly say it's not an either or. There's some people who worked at the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research who are trying to do beautiful things. It's just the broader structures that we're in have such a colonialist legacy of appropriation and expropriation and capture and plunder in racialized ways. So I feel like finding allies even in institutions, even the USDA, there's such brilliant people who are trying to make it work on the inside. Senator Booker trying to make it work at the Hill, so I feel like working broadly, cross-cultural, cross-linguistic alliances are key, and listening to the real experts would be my counsel.
Awesome.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today.
So honored. Thank you, good people.
Likewise. So we are going, I guess, in between each of our speakers, we're going to just do a little 5-minute break, let everybody stretch. Now, today is going to be a little unique for our lunch break. We're going to kind of work through our lunch because really we're just sitting here watching TV, interacting, talking. So you could eat, just keep your camera off so we don't see you get that big whopping mouthful of pasta or whatever. But so we're going to take a 5-minute break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk a whole lot more about seeds. And I guess then our lunch break will only be about a 15-minute official break. So anyway, if you got to go walk the dogs, or that'll be the time. 15 minutes, get back. So anyway, all right.
All right, we'll see you guys in about 5 minutes.